Resident Evil 7 was a great game, full of atmosphere and amazing characters which you got to know over the entire length of the story. It was full of moments like this, where not only you were scared, but you knew the people that were attacking you. This was your girlfriend, this was your wife, and yet she was still willing to do things like cut your hand off with a chainsaw. You knew that these people weren't in control of their own actions, and it was strictly the mold, as it's called in the game, which was impacting them. And this had a large impact. You got to see the previous family relationship. You knew these people weren't bad people. And that added not only just more atmosphere, but you almost felt sorry for the people you were fighting. These weren't just generically evil characters. You got to see their family bond, and it added a lot more tension and atmosphere to the entire game. This is something strictly missing from Resident Evil 8. It just doesn't have the same sequences, the same characterizations, or, quite frankly, the same quality and fear. Now, as it turns out, through various developer interviews, this was deliberate. And to me, quite frankly, it really takes away from the game. But let's have a closer look.
Yes!
Get out the way, Marguerite. Hit-Boy's got to eat. He got to have his supper. Come here, boy. Let's do this.
Shit, he's not eating it, Jack! He's not eating it!
Shut the hell up, Marguerite!
Made that for him!
Now, this is an unusually recognizable scenario. This is just a family dinner which has been perverted. It's been taken to its extremes. You had the family dynamic. You had every single normal relationship involved in there, but they'd been twisted and sickened and made dark. That is one of the things that made the atmosphere so tense in Resident Evil. And you couldn't defend yourself. You didn't even have a gun in this scenario. You had to just run. These people were stronger than you. They could heal. This guy had his arm cut off and he just stuck it back on. It was incredible and it was scary and it was designed to be. This recognizable scenario that anyone could be in. You just stuck in a house with your family when you want to get out. The fact that you knew this was a normal family, the fact you could see the dynamic, made you get attached to these characters, even though they are the villains, because you knew at their hearts they weren't. They couldn't help it. There's nothing they could do. Even in the later expansions, he still tried to look after his daughter. Despite all of the horror, despite everything he turned into, the daughter-father bond was still there and he was still trying to protect her. Now, this isn't something you even get in Resident Evil 8. You don't get to know any of the bosses. They're just sort of there and very quickly dispatched. The three vampire daughters you barely even see. And for all of the characterization that they put into the marketing, so they know that the characters are important, you just get into the game and there's just nothing. It's incredibly disappointing, and it removes all of the tension, it removes all of the fear. There's huge areas where nothing happens, and you know you're perfectly safe. There are rooms where you know you're absolutely perfectly safe, and nothing will ever harm you in it. And while there are indeed tense points, not only are these few and far between, but they're just expected. They're signposted. You know they're coming. And it's not as if you really get surprised. And I'm not on about the odd jump scare through a window, most of which you can actually see coming a mile off in the first place. I'm about actual fear, tension, atmosphere. I'm not being drawn into the game. And it just doesn't have it. And as a recent dev interview shows, this was intentional. They deliberately took all of the Resident Evil out of the Resident Evil. And I'm not saying that Resident Evil 8 is a bad game. I don't think it is. I think it's, albeit a bit expensive, a good, enjoyable experience. I just don't think it's much of a Resident Evil game. It's one which is meant to be full of horror. It's not meant to be an action. It's not meant to be an action shooter. And overall, it seems to have lent into the weak mechanics rather than continued the strong ones over from Resident Evil 7. This was disappointing to me, as Resident Evil 7 was the first Resident Evil I actually really enjoyed. I much prefer a first-person element to a game. And so to see this, to go, oh no, we're now doing Resident Evil 7, but it's a homage to Resident Evil 4. I don't care. I don't want an action shooter. I want a horror game. I want a scary horror game. And the reasons why they've removed it are even more horrific. Let's get into the article. Now, this is a great interview that really showcases how the developers themselves see the difference between 7 and 8. And it's from a producer called, I'm going to call him Mr. Kanda, because I have no idea how to pronounce that name. But it says, in that sense, Resident Evil 7 was a title that came with some big changes. For us, it was a sincere attempt to deliver a true horror experience once more, focusing on an experience played in first person. In the process, we brought Ethan to life. While Sato initially imagined that it would be more difficult to depict a main character in first person, he became more and more attached to the character, and in Village, he wanted to take this further and show how Ethan had grown as a person. This is great. I loved the character Ethan and his story, and I'm glad they continued that, because I think 7 really did need a lot more lore building around it to actually explain what on earth is going on. So I like the character Ethan, I'm glad they explained it. But as you can see, they said deliver a true horror experience once more. They clearly had the perception that the others had kind of left what had started in Resident Evil 1. They were no longer as scary, they weren't focusing on the right points anymore. And Resident Evil really is a game where you're supposed to get anxious. You are supposed to get scared. When I play a Resident Evil game, I want to be constantly on the verge of having to call an ambulance because I might have a heart attack at any second. That is why you play Resident Evil horror games. You don't play them for unicorns and rainbows. It's not meant to be an entertaining experience. It's not meant to be a shooter. If you want a shooter, go and play Warzone. If you want to get scared, that's when you come to a horror game. And that is now deemed to be a problem by the developers of Resident Evil 8. Now, he goes on to say that Resident Evil 7 was more like a reboot that inherited the DNA of the original Resident Evil. It was meant to be a scary horror game. It was meant to leave some kind of emotional impact when you were playing it, which is, to me, what a horror game is meant to be. Whereas you can oppose this to Resident Evil 4, which is what Resident 8 is supposed to be. Resident Evil 8 is supposed to be. It's more of a shooter. It's more of an action game. Where the action and the combat have evolved the most. And evolved the most just means it takes center stage. They've lessened the horror in response and reaction to adding in more combat. If you are better at combat, then you're less scared of the enemies because you can just kill them. This is very different than Resident Evil 7, where they would kill you and there was nothing you could really do to them until the specific boss sections. That made you afraid. That forced you to run. And then the very base instinctual level of humans, you have fight or flight, and if you can't fight and you have to run, it puts you into prey mode rather than a predator. Whereas in Resident Evil 8, you very much feel like the predator. You can have all of these werewolves and everything hunting you, but if you just know you can easily kill them, there's no fear there. And he even goes on to say this himself. They very much know that this is a problem, and this is one that they have introduced voluntarily. He says these two elements could stand in each other's way. If being haunted by the Baker family was frightening because you felt so weak, won't a more action-orientated approach disrupt the balance of that experience? And it very much did. So he says it's something we need to be careful with, but now the game is out, we can see that you really weren't. You had to pick. One does counter the other. And the more skilled you are at combat, the less afraid you're going to be because you're more capable. No one is scared of something they can easily beat. And that is what Resident Evil 8 has turned into. It says if you increase the action, it quickly turns into a game which allows you to kill enemy after enemy. That's not what I want. But it doesn't matter if it's what you want, if that's what you created. He says he hopes that resource management is where the fear comes, rather than actually creating a scary environment. No, now you've got to be scared of simply running out of bullets. It doesn't have the same emotional impact. It removes the atmosphere. Being scared about losing bullets and being scared of the actual thing standing in front of you gives very different emotions, very different levels of impact. He says, when he was creating Village, the team didn't want to just create a scary horror game. While Resident Evil 7 fans were satisfied with the genre, and indeed we were, some players found it too scary to even play. For Village, the team went as an experience that is still scary, but in a way that more players can enjoy. To achieve this goal, they came up with two key phrases that would shape Village's identity: a theme park of horror and ultimate survival horror. And I don't personally care about your buzzwords. You can claim you've got whatever you have. But you've literally admitted that some players found it too scary to even play, and so you changed the game for them. And he goes on, he says, well, aiming for a broader experience, I don't want to lower the game's peak fear. Keeping the peak intact is essential, but if the game is tense throughout, it can become too much for certain players. You know, The weak cowards is what he's referring to. He says, that's why we needed a change in pace and included elements that afford the player a feeling of safety. How am I supposed to be satisfied with that? How am I supposed to be happy with that? It's like, oh yeah, well, some people were satisfied with 7. Basically, we didn't think we sold enough, so we're going to strip everything out of 7 which made it a horror game, and we're going to introduce to you this very bland, boring experience that's void of any soul. We've stripped our horror game of all of the horror aspect, and we're just kind of giving you this dull, boring, safe content because we think that'll have a wide net for everyone to enjoy. Do you know what you don't want to be in a horror game? Do you know what you never want to feel in a horror game? Safe. You want to be scared. When you want to be scared and you want fear, you want to be tense. That tense is the atmosphere. If you remove the tense, you remove the atmosphere. If you remove the fear, you remove the horror game. If you make people feel safe, they may as well go and play a Barbie game rather than Resident Evil, which is solely meant to be mind-shatteringly anxiety-inducing, heart attack-ridden levels of gameplay. That's the only reason for you to exist. That is your game. That is your genre. And if you can't actually create that, you're making a different game. You're not making Resident Evil. You're not making one of the original horror games that was ever made. That one of the certainly the first scary games that I played as a kid. And you're removing the soul. You're removing what makes Resident Evil, and then claiming that, oh, well, we sell more, so that's a good thing. It might be for you. It might be from a business perspective, but from a customer-based perspective, from my perspective, you've completely removed anything that would possibly attract me to your game. And you're just leaving a husk. That's all it is at this point. It's just a husk of what it could have been. And you did all of that. You ripped out the heart of your franchise just because some people are too scared to play a video game. Of all the reasons you could have picked, that's the worst one. Now, you can argue that that could be better for sales. And indeed, if you just go and look at the, 500, 600,000 viewers on Twitch, I'm sure it's beat sales records, you can claim, oh yeah, that was because we made a better experience. But does that logic really stand up? Because generally, when a sequel to a game comes out, they buy the sequel because of how well loved the first one was. No one dislikes the first one and then buys the second one. But if they like the first one, they will buy the second. Now, nobody knew that you had changed Resident Evil 8 to not be like 7. When they bought the game, when they went and watched it, they watched it because of the reputation that 7 had. And I just think if you held out, you would have got the same viewing figures, but a hell of a lot more people would have liked the game, because the game wouldn't have just been this dull mess with no soul. It wouldn't have been this simple experience, which is just going around shooting things in a single-player environment. It would have been the true successor to Resident Evil 7. It would have been a horror game with soul. It would have been a horror game which left a lasting impact upon its players and would have carried on further into the series. It would have been memorable. And I'm just not sure how memorable Resident Evil 8 is. If it doesn't have that emotional impact, if it doesn't make you scared, if it's just literally designed by the developers to be like a theme park, where you can go at your own pace and be as safe as you want, it just doesn't sound like a horror game to me. And it doesn't sound like a Resident Evil game to me. It just sounds like you've got a generic single-player shooter. And quite frankly, maybe other people are satisfied with that. Maybe that's other people's idea of a perfect game. But when you compare it to Resident Evil 7 and how much I like that game, it's just not enough for me. And with that, comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Did you prefer 8 to 7 or do you prefer 7 to 8? Do you really care about this? Do you care how scary your horror games are? Let me know, and if you liked the video, click like. It really helps me out in the algorithm, and click subscribe if you want more videos in the future. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.